This video deals with a rather complicated concept of tax incidence and tax burden. What we will study is the impact of a tax on both buyers and sellers in different scenarios, specifically under the scenario of differing elasticities of demand and supply. So the first graph here depicts a typical market with demand and supply equilibrium, where demand equals supply, and the equilibrium price is $10. Here, the way I've drawn these curves, demand and supply have similar slopes. They have, in fact, the same slope, which means that they have the same elasticities. So elasticity of demand is identical to the elasticity of supply. Now, this green line is the tax that's getting imposed in this market. So we're just going to impose a tax on this product. What I haven't specified is whether this is a tax on buyers or this is a tax on sellers. The interesting thing to note when a tax is imposed is that it does not really matter which segment of the market we are taxing. What a tax does is it creates a wedge between the price that buyers pay and price that sellers receive. Now, in this market, initially we had the equilibrium quantity, let's say given by 100. When we impose a tax, there is a drop in the equilibrium quantity produced in the market. And that's because with the tax, buyers are now paying a higher price. As they pay a higher price, we would expect quantity demanded to decrease. And in fact, sellers also receive a lower price than what they were receiving in equilibrium. And as a result, they will be supplying less. So maybe the quantity dropped to 80 units. And this green line is the tax. Let's say this is a $4 tax on this product. The way we have drawn this is that the tax is equally shared by the buyers and sellers. In other words, when we impose a tax, and it doesn't matter whether we impose a tax on the buyers or on the sellers, the buyers are now paying $12 and the sellers are now getting $8. This gap between them, the two, is $4 or our tax. And this tax has created a wedge between price that buyers pay, so I'm going to just call this BP, and price that sellers receive, which I'm going to call PS. And this wedge is the tax, which in our case is $4. The burden of the tax is given by the share of the tax from the original equilibrium borne by buyers and sellers. In this case, before the tax, buyers were paying $10 for the equilibrium price, and now they are paying $12. So the difference between the price they're paying with the tax and the price they paid before tax, which is 2, is the burden of tax on buyers. On the other hand, sellers before the tax was imposed were receiving $10, the way we have drawn it, and with the tax, they are now receiving only $8. So their burden of the tax in this case is also $2, which is the difference between 10 and 8. So the way we have drawn, because the elasticity of demand equals the elasticity of supply, what we see is that the burden is shared equally between the buyers and sellers. Burden is shared equally. However, in these next two cases, that may not be the case. In fact, in case 2, we have drawn demand to be significantly steeper than supply. So in absolute terms, what we are assuming is that the elasticity of demand is much less than the elasticity of supply. So from our understanding of elasticity, this is the case when buyers are less price sensitive and sellers are much more price sensitive because of the flatter supply curve. So now let's impose the same $4 tax in this market. So I'm just going to have the same tax as I had before, and we'll see where the tax is touching both demand and supply curves. So this is our new tax. What we see here are two things. Number one, if initially the equilibrium quantity was 100, because demand is much less elastic or fairly inelastic, there's a smaller drop in equilibrium quantity. So maybe it drops only to 90, whereas before it dropped to 100, to 80. More importantly, though, is the way the tax burden now gets shared. With a tax, we see that in this case, the buyers are footing more of the tax. So maybe this might be the case when buyers are now paying $13 after tax and sellers are receiving $9. Why is this distribution so? It's because of this key assumption where demand is less elastic or it's inelastic compared to supply. So buyers are kind of stuck with this tax. Whether you tax the sellers, they'll just pass on the tax to buyers as higher prices. If you tax buyers, well, they will share some of the tax with sellers, but they bear majority of the tax. And in this case, the burden that falls on buyers of this tax is what they're paying with the tax minus what they paid in equilibrium. And in this case, it's 13 minus 10, which is $3. Similarly, the burden on sellers is how much they received before tax minus how much they receive after tax, which is 10 minus 9 equals 1. So the principle here is that if demand is inelastic compared to supply, it's the buyers which bear most of the tax. In the third case, we have the opposite situation. Specifically, we have supply being much more steeper. So supply is inelastic, demand is fairly elastic. So now let's impose the same tax in this market. And we see the opposite taking place. In fact, with a tax now, maybe the price that buyers pay is 11, and price that sellers receive is 7. The difference is still $4, which we said is our tax. But now the tax gets distributed quite differently than it was the case before. Now here, because demand is fairly elastic, we see a significant drop in the equilibrium quantity. But more than that, what we see is that now buyers who are paying 11 were paying 10 before, so their burden is only $1. And the way we have drawn the graph, sellers were receiving $10 before the tax, and now they're receiving 7, so their burden is 3. So in this case, the burden of tax is greater on the sellers, and that's because we assumed that the supply is much less elastic than demand, or in fact, supply is inelastic and demand is elastic. When supply is inelastic, it is the sellers who bear most of the tax. When demand is inelastic, it is the buyers who are bearing more of the tax. If we have equal elasticities of demand and supply, like in this case, the burden was equal, like we saw. Both of them shared $2 of the $4 tax. So the key is elasticity. So elasticity is a very useful concept. Not only does it have implications on revenue and pricing, it also has implications on which segment of the market, whether it is buyers or sellers, are bearing or sharing a greater portion of a tax that's imposed on the product. Again, also keep in mind, we did not specify whether we were taxing buyers or sellers. We could tax anyone. The key is that in a market, the burden gets split. Who foots more of the tax? Whichever side is inelastic will share more of the tax because they are less responsive to the prices. They have less room to adjust. The side which is more elastic is more flexible and they will adjust their demand if they are buyers or supply if they are sellers.